that shared. And yeah, so we'll go and get started here. So the sources that I use today, there's really two books, the Why Smart People Make Money Mistakes book, and then the Finance for Normal People. These are both a little bit older, but they're very good, and they did a good summary of some of the research. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I mean, I've studied it in business classes and read a lot about it, but I haven't done any original research. I'm not a researcher, so I'm doing my best to sort of translate this information. There's also a guy, David Laibson, who's a professor who is very good in this field, and I found a presentation online that I heavily borrowed from, which I think it was the intention of that presentation. He was putting it out there for people to be educated and educators to learn from. And then I did take one video that we're going to watch a bit of from, it's replicating an old study, but it's actually by a church. I'm not sure exactly why they did it, but it's a great example of some of the topics we're going to talk about. So really what we're talking about tonight is the idea of sort of economic people versus normal people. And so you can see here on one end of the scale, there's Dr. Spock, who's pretty emotionless and probably is influenced by a lot of these behavioral finance issues that we are. And on the other hand, there's Homer Simpson, who's much more hedonistic, concerned about the future, not too concerned about optimizing their financial outcome. So, people are somewhere between these two, between perfectly rational and then completely and self-control. And another example of that is, I made this little meme, but before behavioral finance was invented, something like a lottery where you have a negative expectation. And right now, the Mega Millions is so big that you might have a slight positive expectation, except that if you have to share the prize, then you actually might not, depending on how many people win. But the old way of thinking about it is just that rational people don't buy lottery tickets. So, by sort of that classic approach, they just wouldn't be sold. But as we know, how lottery tickets get sold. So then from there, the evolution of thought was maybe that irrational people buy them because they're fooled by cognitive errors and biases and things like that, which is probably true to an extent. But really the field's evolved to where now we talk about sort of normal people, which this book by Professor Statman talks about. Normal people buy lottery tickets because of emotional and utilitarian benefits. Let's see, I'm getting some feedback that the sound is not good and there's an echo. So let me just see if I can see which microphone we're. Okay, I think that might be a better microphone. I can also, is it louder when I talk into it there? Not really. I hope that's a little better. Let me just, I hope that's a little bit better. Let me see if I can just turn up the intensity of the microphone a little bit. Yeah, I think that's probably better, I hope. But we'll press on here, and if it's still bad, then please let me know. Okay, good. Somebody said it's a lot better. Okay, so the first main subject we're going to talk about is intertemporal choice, which essentially means when you make decisions about now versus about sometime in the future. And you might think that you would make the same decisions, but actually people make wildly different decisions. And probably one of the best examples of that is what's called the marshmallow experiment, which was run at Stanford University in 1972. And they took a bunch of little kids and they said to them, essentially, here's a marshmallow and you can eat it now if you want to, but if you wait a couple minutes, I'll leave the room. And if you can wait a couple minutes, I'll come back. And if you haven't eaten it, I'll give you a second marshmallow and you can have two. But if you eat it, you just get one. And so, if you were economic, if you were Dr. Spock, you'd say, well, of course, I'll wait a couple minutes to get a second marshmallow and get two rather than just eat one now. But for these kids, it was actually very difficult to not eat the marshmallow. So some did, some didn't. It didn't really correlate with how old they were. There was some talk that actually it would correlate to future life success as far as educational achievement and income and the whole idea of delayed gratification. But in this context, I think it's good because it shows some of this intertemporal stuff that we're talking about. So I'm actually going to play a little bit of the video here. I don't know if you can hear that. It doesn't really matter.
And another one, so you can two, or you can eat it now. So you eat it now, or you can wait and I'll bring you back to, okay? Okay, I'll be
He
back.
wants to. So we don't necessarily have to watch the whole thing here, but I'll just skip ahead a little bit. You know, these kids have a really hard time. It's so good. I just want to watch a couple minutes of it. Like I said, you can see some of the older ones aren't successful. Some of the younger ones are. You know, they can't help but touch it. They can't help but smell it, lick it. She's already, you see, she's already started getting into it. My favorite one is here toward the end. You see a lot of them are licking it, eating it. But this little guy here, you know, there's one of the youngest ones in the video. He manages to hold out. You know, so some studies have indicated that something like, you know, the future is discounted something like half as much as the present. So, you know, which actually correlates here that it's about 50-50, but it's just kind of a fun little study. So here's one for adults though, that actually is very similar, but and also has very similar results. So if you were going to decide between eating oranges and chocolate, you see, if you were deciding today which one you'd eat next week, you know, subjects said 74% of them would decide to eat oranges next week. But then if you said, if you were deciding today, would you choose fruit or chocolate? You'd think it would be similar, but actually it completely flips. And instead 70% choose chocolate, whereas before 74% chose oranges. You can see another study. They had subjects who were thirsty, and they said, "Do you want one sip now or two sips in 5 minutes?" And you could argue, well, it depends on how thirsty I am, whether I'd pick one sip now or two sips in 5 minutes. And it came out about 50-50. You know, it was 60-40, which is pretty reasonable. But then, if you said, "How about one sip in 20 minutes or two sips in 25 minutes?" which really is the exact same decision, just 20 minutes from now. The results were remarkably different, which again, you know, you don't care about how thirsty you are in the future. You'd rather optimize, but as far as right now, you'd rather just get it now rather than trying to optimize and get the best outcome. And there's a number of these studies. We'll just go through a few here that are kind of fun. One is about movies. They didn't actually tell the subjects that they were looking at highbrow versus lowbrow movies, but it was relatively evenly divided between, and the example is Schindler's List versus Spider-Man, movies that are more educational or artistic or good quality versus more just pure entertainment kind of throwaway movies. And they said, if you were picking tonight, 66 of the subjects chose the movies more like Spider-Man, whereas if you were picking a movie to watch next week, only 37% of the subjects chose lowbrow. So that's kind of funny. And if you pick 2 weeks away, it goes down even lower, 29%. So again, it just shows that people tend to respond very differently to their current state of mind and desires versus what they think they might be sometime in the future. Another one is the planning fallacy, which relates to this temporal kind of thing. You know, there's a guy, Douglas Hofstadter, that wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is a book that I've always really liked. And his law is that it always takes longer than you think, even when you take Hofstadter's law into account. So even if you're expecting a delay and you plan for a delay, then it still will be more delayed than you think. And they've even shown that when you explain to project managers about how projects like that have gone previously and that there were unexpected overruns in time and cost and things like that, they're still overconfident that it'll take less time. Students, there's studies where they've talked to students who acknowledge that they finished their old projects earlier in the semester very close to the deadline, but they still assert that they're going to finish their projects in a more timely fashion, not right at the deadline in the future, but then they never do. And it's funny, if you listen to people, you know, if someone calls you and says they're running late, they'll say, whatever time they say, you can probably add 50 to 100% to it. You know, if they say, I'll be there in 10 minutes, that probably means they'll be there in, 15 or 20 minutes, and so on. So again, this is just that more evidence of that intertemporal difference between what you think now and what you think you'll think sometime in the future. So to summarize this topic, there's all kinds of things you could do, and most people have all these plans to do them in the future, but they don't have much interest in doing them now. And probably the best example of that is St. Augustine in some of his writing. He says, give me chastity and continency, just not right now. And I think the investing application to that is there's a couple I listed here. Taking care of estate planning is something that everybody thinks they should do, but they tend to put it off. Getting insurance, putting cash to work, getting properly invested, things like that are all things that come up that you can maybe try to think about and maybe control your natural urges to put those tasks onto your future self rather than addressing them right now. So another good one is mental accounting, which is very relevant to the world of investing, and we have some good examples of that here. So there's a great story that was in one of the books that I mentioned in the beginning, where it's about a newlywed couple who's in Las Vegas and they have $1,000 to gamble and they lose it all. And back in the hotel room, the guy finds a $5 chip after the wife goes to bed, and just the number 17 pops into his head. So he takes the chip and goes downstairs and puts it on, the number 17 on the roulette wheel and wins, which if you pick the number, you get paid 35 to 1. So it should be 37 to 1. That's how the casino makes their money, but you get paid 35 to 1. So he turns his $5 into $175. And then he bets it on 17 again. And 17 comes up again, and he turns his $175 into over $6,000. He does it again and turns $6,000 into $7.5 million. And then the casino says, well, we can't take any more bets. It's too risky, but we found another casino that'll take your bet if you want to keep betting. So he gets in a limo, goes to the other casino and bets his $7.5 million and turns it into $262 million. And then, at that point, they have to get the owner of the casino on the phone, who's a billionaire, and he's trying to win something like $9 billion, and he bets his $262 million on 17, and the ball hits into the pocket of 17 and then goes over into 18. And instead of making $9 billion, he loses $262 million. So he's kind of dejected. He goes back to his hotel room. The new wife wakes up and she says, where were you? And he says, well, I was playing roulette. And she says, how did it go? And he thinks about it for a second and he says, not too bad. I lost $5. So, that kind of is an example of the mental accounting that this sort of behavioral bias is talking about. And that's a major behavioral bias, is the idea that there's some concept of house money, that if you have a financial windfall or an insurance settlement or divorce proceeds or something like that, the idea that there's different money that should be treated differently or act differently than if it's money that you earned or something like that. So there's some really great examples of this. So we'll do one here. You've bought a ticket to a really big entertainment event like the Super Bowl or the opera or something, and you realize once you arrive at the venue that you've lost the ticket. So do you buy another one? And when you do this in surveys, most people say, or many people say, that they would not buy another ticket because they lost this money. But if you frame it differently and you say you go to an event, you're going to buy a ticket for $500, you have $500 with you, but then you realize that somehow you lost $500 some other way. Like the example is you threw it away in an old purse or something that morning and it's gone. Do you buy the ticket? And when you ask the question this way, most people say they would go ahead and buy the ticket, even though it's the exact same scenario. They had $500 that they lost. They still need to spend $500, but again, Dr. Spock would act exactly the same in both of these situations, but people like you and me tend to be much more likely to do the second one rather than the first one. Another example is if you go to the store and you're going to buy a lamp and you can go down the street just a short distance, just a couple blocks, and buy another lamp, would you do it? And most people would say, yeah, I would go drive 5 blocks to save $25 on this lamp. But if you ask the question this way, if it's sort of the exact same fact pattern, except it's a much bigger purchase, most people would say, well, of course not. I'm not going to drive, get my car and drive down the street to save 25 bucks on a $2,000 purchase. That's crazy. But of course, it's exactly the same. Dr. Spock would be equally likely to go to the other store in both these situations, but people like you and me would not. And the way this comes up in day-to-day life is there's the concept of bundling, where people who sell things combine things together. A great example in one of the books is that somebody has an older car that still runs perfectly well and they're perfectly happy with it, except the stereo dies, and this person doesn't want to spend $500 for a new stereo. So they think about it and they think about it and they think, well, I'll just buy a new car. So they spend $25,000 on a new car. And oh, by the way, they upgrade the stereo from just the regular one to a nicer one for another $1,200 as part of that price. But when it's framed in that context, they have no problem spending $1,200 for a stereo. Whereas when they had a perfectly good car, they were perfectly happy with, except for the stereo, they wouldn't spend $500. So that's a good example of how this can come up in your life. This is an example just recently. I was in Ireland for a wedding with my family, and we thought we had an opportunity to volunteer to take a later flight. And they offered us a hotel room in Dublin. We were in Ireland, and $2,000 a person, or 2,000 euros a person, to take a flight just the next day. And it wasn't even a flight credit. It was actually, they were essentially going to give a debit card that you could spend on anything. And, I was talking to my daughter about it. There's 3 of us, so it was 6,000 euros. And I think what she envisioned was something like a little bit of, hedonism there, like eating at pretty nice restaurants and kind of a shopping spree type environment with our time remaining that day in Ireland. And we could have done fun stuff, but I was thinking more like Dr. Spock in that, the 6,000 euros is 6,000 euros. And it doesn't matter if it's sort of found money or if it's money from work or really where the money came from. I was trying to explain to her that it was, the fungibility of money, as the saying goes. And I'm not sure that she completely agreed. Another example that comes up is, you see this all the time. And in fact, there's an article I read recently about how to get a free Disney vacation. And it was actually pretty complicated. It was like a shuttle launch. You have to get these 3 different credit cards and get a certain level of spending on each one. And one would pay for your flights, and one would pay for your hotel room, and one you could somehow use for your park admission. And it's fine. And it's true that if you jump through all those hoops, you could essentially have a free vacation. But on the other hand, it essentially was like a job going through all that. It was pretty complicated. And at the end of the day, you had these resources you could have used on anything, on cashback or other things, or other trips you were going to take anyway. So is it really a free vacation, or is it a vacation you sort of worked for and could earn? But, it's not like, the saying goes, it's a hard way to earn easy money, I think, if you think about it like that. So again, bringing this back to investment principles. Let's see how we're doing on time. We have a lot to cover, so I think we're doing good. One thing that comes up is, we talked about this with the flight credits, but inheritances or windfalls or things like that. Something I see all the time in our industry is particularly young people. I knew somebody that inherited something like $200,000, I think, at the age of something like 22 or 23. And what happened was, that could have been the cornerstone of a nest egg that could have accomplished a lot of things, and early retirement options or long-term income. And really, it sort of, instead, it was framed as found money that could just be spent, and it just sort of sat in an account and kept getting withdrawn. And pretty soon, after a couple of years, it was gone. And I said, think about the 4% rule, because anytime you get any kind of inheritance, you can think about it almost like a pension, in the sense that pretty much no matter what your age is, if you take that money and invest it in sort of a prudent allocation and keep it invested for the long term, you can spend something like 4% or less of the initial amount adjusted for inflation for the rest of your life. So for example, it was $100,000. You could spend probably $3,000 or $4,000 a year the first year, adjust that up for inflation every year, and essentially probably never run out of money in that account. There's periods where it would be kind of close or you might fail, but rather than thinking about a windfall like that as a one-time thing that gets spent and it's gone, you can think about it as something that's there for the long term. And especially if you don't withdraw it, then that's something that can grow. You know, a rough rule of thumb, especially if you're invested in stocks, is that those might double something like every 7 to 10 years. So if you think about being in your early 20s, you know, by age 30, that 200 might turn into 400, say 40, 800, and pretty soon, you know, you've got $1 million sort of portfolio that you can start drawing on and then actually replace, you know, a good bit of your income pretty early in life. Another major mental accounting issue that comes up for people is, well, this also goes into loss aversion, which we're not actually going to talk about too much because we're just not going to have enough time. But, you know, some people would, if let's say you had $1 million and you invested it and over a year and you earned $1 on it, which is essentially what happens more or less in savings accounts these days. It's not quite that bad, but you know, you might consider that a great success. Whereas if you had $1 million and put it into some riskier investment that fluctuated up and down, and at the end of the year you had $999,000, which is really pretty insignificantly different from where you started, people would consider that a huge failure and would insist on holding on to that investment until it broke even, and would be upset about it. And the issue is there's nothing magical about earning positive 0.1% versus negative 0.1%, or, you know, I'd even argue there's nothing special about gaining, say, 5% versus losing 5% or 20% either direction. What really matters is that your investments are the things that are best positioned for the future. It really doesn't matter what's happened, and there's no obligation to make up and break even or anything like that, because you can wait in an investment for years to break even, and you might be proud of yourself that you didn't lose $1 on it, but at the same time, the opportunity cost of not being invested in something more appropriate for you can be devastating. So I think that's an interesting point to consider as well. Another thing that comes up is, I put living on the dividends here. It used to be that a retirement plan was to save some money and buy bonds that earned, you know, some kind of interest, and then you know, essentially live on that for the rest of your life, you know, something like 5%. The idea would be that you live on the interest and dividends, but never touch the principal. And that's fine if you can do that. But these days, with the level of interest rates and the negative real returns we see, you would need a much more huge portfolio to live off the dividends than if you were just willing to generate cash by a combination of interest, dividends, and selling your gains off of your stocks by just selling, you know, some shares each year to meet your goals, and doing it that way. There's no nobility in not touching the principal, if that makes sense, or not touching the underlying investments. So, I mean, I know of somebody, again, I have all sorts of stories. I know of somebody that was an investment banker and retired, I think, with $5 or $6 million, but he's very risk averse, and he doesn't want to. He just wants to find income producing assets that can fund his lifestyle. But what that means is he's actually living, you know, again, with the 4% rule, you should probably be able to spend something like, you know, over $100,000 a year if you have a $5 million portfolio. But in his case, he's trying to live on the interest and not touch any of the underlying investments. And he's even had to take a second job, you know, just sort of a minimum wage, part-time job, just to feel more confident that his money's going to last. So I think he's very affected by the concept of mental accounting. The next thing we're going to talk about is choice, consumer choice, and this is more of kind of the defense against the dark arts stuff that I was talking about earlier. It's really interesting how all of us, how you and I are manipulated by some of the behavioral biases we naturally have that retailers and people like that have become aware of. So here's an example, and this is from a slightly older study when people actually bought CD players, but so one example, so one choice is that there's a CD player that you're interested in. It's on sale for $99, which is a very good price. Do you buy it or do you wait and shop around and keep shopping? And then the other alternative is the exact same situation. It's a desirable CD player. This was given to the other group, but also in addition to the Sony, there's an even higher quality CD player that's more expensive, which also is a pretty good price. Do you make a purchase or do you wait and shop more? And so in the first example, 33% of the people decided to wait, but ironically with more choice in the second one, 46% decided to wait and only 54% bought. And it doesn't even matter which one they bought. But by having more choice, they were sort of more paralyzed. And so they just bought less. This is another example. They set up a table at they called it a fancy grocery store. It sounds kind of like a Whole Foods, but I think this study was in the 80s. And they set up a display and it had a $1 off coupon for these jams that they were giving free tastes of. And the choices alternated hourly. For the first hour, they would have a selection of 6 jams you could try. And 30% of the people, and they knew because when the people came up to the display, the coupon they gave you was coded as to how many jams were available at that time. So when 6 jams were available, 30% of the people made a choice and bought one. But when they made a huge display of 24 that you could taste, and people tasted a lot more people actually went to the booth to taste them because it was sort of a novelty, but only 3% actually bought anything, which is a dramatic, huge difference, which just shows that sometimes choice is not necessarily good. In this sense, we're not thinking of it in terms of being a retailer, but instead we're thinking of a person who's trying to make decisions. And sometimes no decision is good, but if you're actually trying to make a decision, it's better to have fewer choices if at all possible. And this next one is really interesting too. It's about the good, better, best idea. So the example they gave was that there's a small microwave for sale that's 35% off the list price, and a medium microwave that's also 35% off the list price, but more expensive. And you can see it's a pretty even split. 57% of the people bought the small and 43% bought the large. If you give the exact same choices, however, except you add a third choice, which is even larger and more expensive, and in fact, in this case, it wasn't even as good of a deal. It was only 10% off the list price. What's interesting is a few people bought that one, but actually many more people bought the medium microwave than before because that third choice was out there. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's fascinating. Sometimes, and this happens not only in retail, but also on menus at restaurants. For example, if you're at a fancy restaurant that has nice steaks, there might be a $30 steak and a $50 steak, but if they have some kind of fancy Wagyu or something on the menu, even if nobody buys it, if it's $150, just by having that third more expensive choice, a lot more people will buy the $50 steak over the $30 steak. And part of it's because the research indicates that people just have aversion to extremes. They don't want to buy the cheapest thing. They don't want to buy the most expensive thing. They just want to sort of be in the middle. It's a little bit of the herd mentality stuff too at work there. So the next thing in numeracy is one of the books described it as that it's a lot of these biases we've talked about are because people are emotionally affected by the choices that are offered to them. But in some cases, it's because it's just difficult for us to do the kind of math that's necessary to make choices very quickly. So, and we'll kind of hit these rapid fire, but one of them is, some of these are kind of like parlor tricks, but I think they tell important stories. One is that, if you have two bags, and they contain red and white chips, and one contains 2/3 red chips and one contains 1/3 red chips. And then, so this actually is sort of one of the foundational things about how people don't understand math. If they tell you to sample 5 chips out of the first bag and 30 out of the second one, you would guess that the one that has the higher percentage of red chips, these are the percentage of red chips, you'd guess that the 4/5 red chips sample would be from the one that has the higher number of red chips in the bag, but it's actually not true. The fact that this one had 20 out of 30 is red indicates very strongly, well, it works out that it's the 2/3 red chip bag. And even though this one had a higher one, since this number of samples was so small, this actually turned out to be the one that had 1/3 red chips. And it's, the extreme example of that is if you reach into a bag and just pull out 1 chip, well, that doesn't really give you any information because it could be just completely random what color you got. But the point of it is that larger sample sizes are much more reflective of what's actually going on than small numbers of observations. The next one is kind of a fun example. It's called Steve the Shy Neighbor. And what it had to do with is it describes your next door neighbor in the study. And it says, you got this guy that lives next door, Steve. He's very shy, reserved, very meticulous and fastidious with his house, all those sorts of things. Would you guess that Steve is a salesman or a librarian? And most people, when they hear that description, they would guess that Steve is a librarian, but actually the answer is probably that Steve is a salesman. And the reason is, if you look at the numbers, there's probably 30, 40, 50 million salespeople in America. Most people in some way or another are salespeople in some form or another in their job, but there's actually probably only maybe 100,000 librarians. So there might be 50 or 60 salesmen for every librarian. So the chance that your neighbor is a librarian is so vanishingly small that there's probably a lot more shy, reserved, fastidious salesmen than there really are librarians of any type. So that's another example. Talking about lotteries again, if I said, what are the chances that if they did the Powerball drawing or the Mega Millions drawing, what are the chances that the numbers will come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the drawings? And you say, well, the chances are almost zero that would happen. I mean, that's crazy. Like, how would that possibly happen when there's 40 different balls or something like that? And the answer is it is very unlikely, but also I put the numbers of the most recent winning jackpot, which was, you could see 25, 37, 38, 65. The chances of those numbers coming up, or whatever numbers on your ticket, are just as likely as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it sort of just helps you understand the vanishingly small chances of winning a lottery better than if you just, sort of think, well, somebody's got to win and all that kind of stuff. Again, talking about probabilities, when the movie Jaws came out, everybody was terrified to go to the beach. But again, the chances of a shark attack and being killed by a shark are so vanishingly small that even if there was a shark attack on a beach nearby last week, the chances of it happening again are almost zero. I think something like 10 people a year are killed by sharks, and I think it was said the world, but that's even hard to believe. But it's a very small chance. Another example is the circus. Every so often there's a big, just recently there was an accident where somebody was killed on a ride at sort of a fair, a circus type thing. And it wasn't like the machinery failed. It was just a compliance issue with the workers. So, ironically, probably a lot of people stopped going to that fair. But on the other hand, especially if they were able to keep their insurance, they probably had to do so much training and so much work. And, all the employees there were probably so incredibly well qualified after that accident that it was probably the safest park in the world. But nobody would probably want to go to it, at least for a while. Another thing that comes up a lot is the idea of gambler's fallacy and hot hands, where if you're watching basketball, if somebody's made 5 in a row, then you think they're going to make 6 in a row. But really, if you're at the last second of the game and looking to who you're going to give the ball to, you should really give it to whoever has the best long-term percentages, because just like flipping a coin over and over again, there's no reason to believe that these sort of streaks persist any longer than they already have just by random chance. Another thing that really is relevant to investing is the idea of a big stock market crash. You know, there's jokes that the average investor has predicted 25 of the last 6 stock market downturns and things like that. People are always convinced there's something right around the corner, but if you look at the numbers, we actually have a slide about this next, but you know, people are irrationally afraid of stock market downturns and recessions if you look at the big picture. Insurance comes up a lot. You know, people have low deductibles, but there's been studies that show, for example, with homeowners insurance, the amount of extra money you pay by having something like a $500 deductible on your homeowners insurance, it's a very short amount of time, a very short number of years where you wouldn't be better off having a much higher deductible, like $4,000, $5,000, something like that. So people perceive there's a lot more risk and that they'll make a lot more claims than they do, but it's actually very rare that people make claims. So often you're much better off having the highest deductible you can possibly manage. You know, there's all kinds of insurance now. I mean, I've even seen on personal finance, you know, pages, people saying, you know, is it safe to self-insure for my pet? I mean, the idea that self-insurance, meaning just paying out of pocket for your pet's expenses, that's not the standard. It's very surprising for some people. Travel insurance, things like that come up all the time. Travel insurance is very expensive compared to the chances you'll actually get it paid out if you read the fine print, because there's so many hoops you have to jump through. You know, some cases you have to get doctors' notes that not only indicate you were sick, but actually unable to travel if you want to take advantage of your travel insurance. So the point is, you need insurance for the appropriate risk you need to protect against, but many people have too much insurance for no particularly good reason. This is, again, tying it back to the stock market. You can see the shaded areas are US, this is a broad market index going back about 50 years. The shaded areas are US recessions, and you can see they're really pretty rare. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 recessions that have been documented in the last 50 years. And you can see this is on a log scale, but and you know, the axis is again just the logarithm. So all this means is that you know, if you look at the downturns in the stock market, the ones you can actually perceive, they're very, very rare. So the idea of holding money out for a big downturn or waiting to invest, certainly you can dollar cost average in if you feel very uncomfortable about getting in the stock market now. But from the perspective of somebody who's going to retire in 2022, looking back, you wouldn't really care. I mean, just for example, if you look at 1987, you wouldn't really care if you got invested there or there. What you'd really hope for is that you just got invested as much as possible, as far left as you could get on this chart. Because, you know, I've read about people talking about investing for their entire career for 40 years, and they say, well, the market fluctuates up and down, so I'm just concerned that when I'm at retirement, you know, my retirement accounts will be on a downturn and I'll have lost money over my investing career. And it just, it shows that people don't really appreciate just how powerful the sort of magnet that pulls up stock market returns in the long run is. And this is a really great analogy. They call it the leaky boat. If you imagine you're taking a journey across an ocean and your boat is represented by your investment portfolio, which has to get you the whole way there. A lot of people are very critical of their boats, and they're constantly looking at them to see if they're taking on water, and you know, it rains, so there's water in the bilge and it has to go out the pump or get bailed out. And some people, at the first sign of water in their boat, they want to jump ship and go to a different boat, and they do that all the time, and it's very expensive, you know, in the analogy to buy and sell boats while you're at sea. And the fact is, all boats leak somewhat, and all boats take on water for waves and storms and things like that. But what you should really be focused on is picking the boat that has the best chance of, in the long term, getting you to the other coast as fast as possible. And in the short term, you really shouldn't think about these short-term perturbations you should be really thinking about just staying invested and being in a consistent strategy that's going to get you there for the long term, in our opinion. So we're running a little short on time here, so we wanted to definitely get into anchoring, which I think is a really interesting bias here. So this is an example where they describe two restaurants, and I won't read this to you, but the whole point of these descriptions is that these descriptions are different, but they're really difficult to choose between. If you read them both these restaurants sound good. It's hard to pick. And in fact, when you give it to a control group, it's about 50-50 which restaurant the people would select. And what's interesting is that if you present this instead, rather than in the paragraphs, if you present it as bullet points, line by line, where you sort of compare the facts about each one, what's interesting is that, again, the results end up being about 50-50, but whichever factor you present first for the respondents when they select one. So for example, I said one restaurant is the creme de la creme in the area, and the other one has a national reputation. Whichever one the respondent preferred of those two choices that were presented first, as they filled out the rest of it and looked at the other options, they tended to prefer the one that they liked first. So whichever the first two choices were, they tend to continue to prefer that one and choose that one, regardless of really what the other points are that are brought up. So that's a really good example of this anchoring bias. And sometimes you can essentially tell people that you're anchoring them to a certain number and they don't care. They understand it and they perceive it, but they still remain anchored, and it influences their decisions. So the example here is, it talks about Genghis Khan. And the question is just, essentially the question is, what year did Genghis Khan die? And if you ask a whole bunch of people that, the answers will probably be all over the place, but the average of those answers is probably going to be pretty close to the correct answer, which is 1227. But if you ask it this way, did these events happen before or after AD 151? No, that's my zip code. It has nothing to do with this. It takes that average, which should be about 1200 or so, and dramatically skews it hundreds of years earlier to, I can't remember, but I think in this example, the average was something like 600. And there's another actual study just like this that instead of Genghis Khan, it was about Attila the Hun. And instead of providing a random number like 8151 here, they actually said, sort of one of the steps, they asked some questions. They talked about Attila the Hun, and then they said, what year did Attila the Hun die? But before they asked that, they said, take the last 3 digits of your phone number and add 400 to that and write the answer here, which obviously is a completely random number. It has nothing to do with anything, but just by writing down a random number that the respondent knew was a random number, it still dramatically skewed their guess to whatever that number was, even though it was completely meaningless. So here's some real world examples of this. They took some real estate brokers, and this was a number of years ago, so this, the house prices are a little bit lower. These are not appraisers. These are the type of people that would list houses for sale if somebody came to them to list them. And they said, one house is listed at, well, you can read it here. I won't read it to you, but essentially one house was listed at 65,000, and they said it was worth about 67. And another house was listed at about 84,000, and they said, well, that one's only worth 75,000. There's a detailed 10-page packet of information, and these two appraisals were 10% apart. And when they asked them how they chose the price that they chose for what they thought it was worth, less than 25% mentioned using the listing price as a factor. But of course, the punchline is it was the same house. They just took two separate groups of real estate brokers to the same house. The 10-page packet of information was exactly the same. They just had a different listing price, and you can see how big of a difference that made. This is probably one of the most famous examples of this behavioral finance stuff becoming useful in the real world. 401k plan participation among workers is relatively low. People don't use the match. Something like 40% of people opt into their 401k plans. If you make it easy, where all they have to do is check a box in their onboarding documents, it raises the participation sum. If they actually force you to choose, whereas there is no default, but you can't proceed and go to work unless you literally check a box, yes or no, as to whether or not you want to participate. That actually raises the participation rate to 70%. And if they make participation the default and force you to opt out, it jumps it all the way to 90%, which is generally, it's hard to argue that participation in a plan like this is not a good thing. Nobody says, I really wish I'd saved a lot less money 10 years ago, and I wish I hadn't had these tax benefits and things like that. So this is a real world example, and it shows that if you can sort of do this in your life and automate your finances in a way that money is segregated before you even look at it and things like that, you can sort of nudge yourself into these choices. There's just a few examples here. The ways that sort of the dark arts get applied to you is, the first thing I had there is anchoring and aphorisms. It's just things like people saying cash is king and you never went broke taking profits and things like that. Often that's really bad advice, but people just need heuristics in their heads to make decisions, so they get stuck in that. A great example is tires. The tire industry, I think, has done a good job of promoting more expensive tires by saying, well, you just can't put a price on safety, and these types of tires are much better than the imported ones and things like that. But there's not a lot of evidence that expensive tires are that much safer than more inexpensive tires, but there's people that believe that. The diamond industry has really drilled this idea of anchoring 2 months' salary as the appropriate price for a diamond ring. Negotiations are a big thing. You have probably heard people say that you should always wait in a negotiation and go second and respond. But actually, there's evidence that I took a course with Peter Capelli, who's an expert in negotiations, and he pointed out that you actually should generally go first, because whatever number gets mentioned first in a negotiation is what gets anchored to, and that can have a big impact on the ultimate result. Brand loyalty is another big thing. People tend to stick with the brands they have just because they get anchored to them. And we already talked about the idea of anchoring to the idea of a break even, or a zero. People would much rather earn $1 than lose $1, even if it's a large sum of money. So people definitely get anchored to that break even thing. So we're getting onto the ego trap stuff now, and we are running a little bit low on time, but let's see if we can press through here. This is an interesting, thing to try. The point of this is not to get the questions right here, but it's to give a range for each one that you're 90% sure that the answer lies within that range. And what's interesting about that is you would think that, so if you did it perfectly correctly, the ranges you expressed, 9 out of 10 or so would be, the answers would be within that range, and there'd probably be one that was an outlier. But what ends up happening, even though there's no penalty for having a very wide range, people are still overconfident in getting anchored to their guesses, and they make their ranges much too narrow. In fact, often when people do this quiz and they express the ranges, they only get about 3, 4, or 5 of these in the correct range sometimes, because they're too overconfident. And if you're curious, those are the answers. But the answers don't really matter as much as how you perceive the idea of a 90% confidence interval. This is a good one. Again, this has to do with ego and getting set on one answer. So, there's the question that we're trying to answer, and there's some examples of pronunciations here: Louisville or Louisville or Louisville. And people feel very strongly about this, and they would bet a large amount of money on the correct pronunciation. But actually, I encourage you to think about how much money you'd bet on the correct answer. And what the punchline is it's a little bit of a parlor trick, but having lived in Kentucky, I would say most people would say Louisville instead of those other 2 choices, but the correct answer is actually Frankfort. The capital of Kentucky is Frankfort. So if you said something like that, you would actually be correct. But people would argue to the death about which way they're pronouncing Louisville, when actually they're not even paying attention to the real question. And overconfidence, in this ego thing really applies to investments, because people don't understand they don't understand how much they've lost versus how much they've gained, and they remember their gains and they forget their losses. There's a real interesting thing about a survey of investors, and you compare to their performance. And they ask, what is the most recent closing level of the Dow Jones Industrial Average? And actually, the more accurate people were about knowing the level, the less good their returns tended to be. And it's because people that really paid attention to it closely were very overconfident in their ability to do investing, and they would turn their portfolios over a lot and generate a lot of capital gains and things like that, and taxes. And generally their performance was not as good as people that had no idea where the Dow level is at any given time. There's a apocryphal story about Fidelity or somebody like that doing an analysis of their best performing investors, and that, self-directed, and it turned out that many of the best performing investors over the last 5 years turned out to actually be deceased, and just they hadn't submitted the paperwork yet. So I don't know if that's true, but again, especially in investing, the more confident you are, the better chance that maybe you're not on the right track. So we're running a little bit out of time here, but I think that third point about people who think they're beating the market consistently, they'll tell you about how they have these tremendous returns and they make 25% a year. But when you actually start digging in, they remember the things that have done very well, and they only remember them for the periods they've done very well, and they sort of forget about the short-term results that actually, or I'm sorry, the downturn results that actually make them often average investors at best. So I think this is a really important point, and unfortunately, we're probably going to have to cut it off here pretty soon because we're running out of time. I had a little bit more on nudge theory, but I won't read every word of this. But the point is, any individual who's not professionally occupied in the financial services industry, and even most of those who are, including me, I would say, are really probably not going to be very effective at picking stocks in the long run. And index investing really does work. And the approach we have here, where we have, I guess I would call it sort of index investing plus, where we have very broad investments, but then they sort of do tilt towards some factors that tend to drive long-term outperformance. We use that philosophy here and we stick with it. And there's no, we're pretty qualified. I mean, we have a lot of certifications and education, and we've a lot of experience in the financial industry, but we are not probably that great at picking stocks, just like you're not, even though, I love the way they say it here. Most people, probably you and me, have no business at all trying to pick individual investments like that. And we could probably make things more exciting here if we did try to make choices like that and churn things around and move investments in and out of different things, but that's just really not what we do. And we really are convinced, going back to that leaky boat analogy, that just sticking in the boat that we think is going to go the fastest in the long run is much better than trying to do all these other things. So we have just a few minutes here. We've talked about a lot of behavioral biases and heuristics and things like that, but kind of the most interesting thing that's come out of that in the last few years is this idea of nudge theory, which is actually taking these phenomena and actually applying approaches to actually influence people based on this. And it can be good and bad. It can have positive results like the opting out of 401ks, but also there's a lot of marketing people that have used this kind of stuff pretty heavily to work against you. So this is kind of interesting. There's people that have to pay taxes in the UK to their local sort of county, more or less, or city. And what they found is it used to be they just get an invoice and a lot of people wouldn't pay them. But they found that if you make, so the second one here, if you make a diagram where you show sort of where they are in the process and how much they owe and the penalty for not paying, and give them more information, that increases the number of people paying taxes in response to these letters by something like 13%. But the best thing is the social norm, where you don't even make threats or really describe anything other than you just say, 96% of people in your council pay taxes on time, and you're in the very small minority of people who have not paid yet. And when you use that messaging, it increases the collections by 19%, which was by far the most effective that they saw in this study, which is pretty interesting. And I've seen this sticker on gas cans, but this is another example. Rather than the old-fashioned way of saying, don't start fires with gasoline, it's dangerous, people get burned. They do a little bit of an appeal to authority with this fireman person here, but they say, there's no safe way to start a fire with gas. That's why most parents don't do it. And then they say, most parents don't, but some do. And I think the reason this message is more effective is rather than attacking you, it makes you say, well, most parents don't do that. I'm glad I don't do that either. And I'll definitely make sure I don't. And it's just less confrontational, and it's a lot more effective. We're running low out of time. We won't talk about all these, but just in Amsterdam airport, they found out that putting a little picture in the toilets in the bathroom improved gentlemen's aim a lot better, surprisingly, by a dramatic amount. At the grocery store, if they just put giant green arrows on the floor pointing toward the produce section, they sell a lot more produce and a lot less packaged goods. If you give people smaller trash cans and bigger recycling bins, they tend to recycle more. All those sorts of things are really interesting. One of the scariest things is I heard somebody talk about how they consulted with Uber on how to increase tipping. And you can see here, with Uber, if you notice, there's not percentages here, and these are just some screenshots from different people's tip screens I found on the internet. And what's fascinating is the way that these things are selected. You can see it's $1, $2, $6, $1.25, no tip, $3.5. I mean, there's different choices. And again, we learned that probably you're going to pick the middle one if you pick one at all. But what's fascinating is these choices are given to you based on your prior tipping behavior, and they're specifically designed to elicit the maximum tip from you. So two people with the exact same ride could have totally different tip selections. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and it's almost kind of scary, the things that are out there. So we're pretty much running out of time here. There's some conclusions here that, again, I won't read them to you because we're kind of running out of time, but I hope these are useful. The next screen, some action items. We talked about the intertemporal stuff. Think about the future you. Think about your deductibles and self-insuring, so to speak. If you have opportunities to get matches and things like that, you should probably optimize them. Even just keeping track of your finances through something like Mint or YNAB, you need a budget. Even if you don't have any specific plan, just looking at your expenditures can reduce your spending if that's something you want to accomplish. And I'll just make a plug here at the end. I think the best financial nudge, so to speak, is to actually use a financial advisor, which there's a lot of studies that have shown the value financial advisors provide. There's one called Advisor Alpha by Vanguard you can read about that's really interesting. But I think that it's understated how much just having an advisor to help you stay the course and not jump boats, in the leaky boat analogy, can have a huge positive impact on your long-term financial future. And just to close out, this is an example of something from, you can see from JP Morgan Asset Management. It shows the returns of all sorts of different investment asset classes over the last 20 years. So you can see, it doesn't even really matter, but you can see that the returns are pretty solid, low double digits, high single digits. But what's fascinating is that if you look at the average investor, which is based on, it says down here somewhere where it came from. Yeah, based on analysis by Dalbar Inc., which utilizes the net of aggregate mutual fund sales, redemptions, and exchanges. Basically, even if you're only invested in things that perform well, if you buy high and sell low and make the wrong decisions and buy the things that are popular on TV when they're popular and sell them when you get dejected because they're having a downturn, most investors, I think, tend to underperform the things they're invested in, if that makes sense, which is kind of a sad result for many people. But again, because of overconfidence, a lot of people don't realize that's happening. So advisors can provide a lot of different advantages and planning and all that sort of stuff, but just having somebody to reinforce to you and give you that nudge, not to make too many changes and not to chase performance, I think can have an absolutely tremendous result and outcome on your long-term financial future. So that's it. We're about out of time here. Obviously, we just barely scratched the surface of this topic, but I hope some of these little stories were interesting. And again, I think the bottom line is I hope that this encourages you to come up with a long-term financial plan, hopefully in concert with your Telluride advisor, but also just to keep in mind that there's a lot of information that's being used potentially against you at all times. So when you think about consumer choices, just keep in mind that not every choice is yours, and the ideas you have, you might either become from behavioral biases you don't even know you have, or you might actively be being manipulated to make decisions you might not make otherwise. So I hope that's helpful. You can see our contact information here if you want to follow up or have any questions or anything else we can help you with. So I hope that was useful, and we'll sign off and let us know if we can help further. Thank you very much.